Hello.
Good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to welcome you to Hart House as we come together in commemoration of Orange Shirt Day and the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It was on January 13, 2017, that the final report from the Steering Committee for the U of T response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was presented by Elder Andrew Wesley to President Merrick Gertler and Vice President and Provost Cheryl Reguera here at Hart House, and we are so pleased to host everyone from our 3 campuses for this occasion. My name is David Kim, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm here today as Warden of Hart House, so thank you for coming today. I come from an immigrant family of Korean ancestry that settled on Treaty 13 territory in Toronto after immigrating from Korea over 50 years ago. We very often express our gratitude for being able to come to this land, and to stand here today in commemoration of this day fills me with so much gratitude and respect. So a couple things. We're going to flip to the agenda here. Thank you. So as you can see, welcoming you this morning. Shortly we'll have Professor Alex Gillespie up to do the land acknowledgement and welcome remarks, followed by greetings from Chancellor Rose Patten. After that, we look forward to a panel discussion. So we have 3 individuals here. It's moderated by Angela Henshelwood, and the panelists are Grant Hurley, Mikayla Redden, and Desmond Wong, and to be introduced by Isa Ahmad. So we'll do some introductions for these individuals, and then we'll have the conclusion of the event at 12 p.m. We'd also like to outline some supports that are available today. So if you take note on the slide overhead, we have U of T TELUS Health student support by calling the number outlined here, and then the EFAP program with the number in the 3rd paragraph there, and the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line with 24-hour crisis support. So please take note of this information if needed. And also, if you're seeking any additional information, please feel free to connect with any of the event staff around here today. So one thing to note is that you'll observe a number of non-Indigenous individuals that are part of today's event, in addition to our Indigenous colleagues that are contributing either behind the scenes or through their participation on the panel. So this is an intentional decision from the Planning Committee, who we will highlight a little later, so that we engage others and not have the work of the day fall on the shoulders of our Indigenous peers. I would now like to introduce you to Alex Gillespie, Vice President and Principal, University of Toronto Mississauga. I will read a short bio. So Alex Gillespie is Vice President of the University of Toronto and Principal at U of T Mississauga, where she has had the privilege to teach as a professor of global book history for the past 20 years. As Vice President and Principal, Alex champions the university's priorities and works to build reciprocal relationships across our Mississauga and Peel communities. She's deeply committed to realizing U of T's promise to remain North America's top public university for the employability of our graduates and to give all our students the lift of a lifetime. And she's proud to be part of a U of T community, a UTM community, where some of the best students, faculty, and staff in the world work to make the world a better place. Thank you, Alex.
Bonjour, Ani, kia ora koutou, Alexandra Gillespie, Indigenous. It is my great privilege, as you just heard, to serve as Vice President and Principal of the University of Toronto Mississauga. I am a Pākehā New Zealander from an English, Scottish and French-German colonial family that settled in Whakatu and Te Whanganui Atara in Aotearoa. But now I work, live and raise my family here on the traditional lands of the Wendat, Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, at a meeting place that's home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land in Toronto, Scarborough and Mississauga, which stems from relationships formed in Treaties 13 and 13A. I also know that that opportunity carries responsibilities rooted in the living history of this place. My family and I live in a house called Lylehurst on U of T's Mississauga campus. It looks out over the Missinihi, the Trusting Creek. That's the river that the British called the Credit because at its mouth they traded goods on credit with Indigenous peoples who have travelled and cared for its waters and shores for thousands of years. This history animates our place at U of T now as we work to build a community worthy of trust and earn the chance to learn with Indigenous peoples. Part of that work means answering calls to action of Wichi Hedowin and living the values of the eagle feather given at Wichi Hedowin's entrustment: respect, honour, strength, courage, and wisdom. It also means being kind and true in all relations, including as we honour Indigenous lives taken at residential schools and stand with the communities who carry that legacy today. That's part of the story painted on our orange t-shirts, designed by MJ Singleton, an Ojibwe Two-Spirit student from Migisahi, Sagaigan First Nation, who is studying at U of T. Our shirts show children showing their mother's hands as flowers and life and love bloom all around them. The design, and here I'm learning from MJ, from an interview they gave earlier this year, the design is about healing intergenerational trauma and about how we can feel for and with other people and be there for each other with support and with love. I'm grateful to MJ for that teaching and to the Office of Indigenous Initiatives for the opportunity to be with you here today. Chi Miigwech for the invitation to stand with you in care and truth. And Miigwech to all Indigenous colleagues and community for the friendship they show to U of T. Let us honour that friendship as we realise the responsibilities of this land, as we answer calls to action, and as we live a good life together.
Thank you, Alex, for a really thoughtful welcome and for the background on the t-shirt from MJ Singleton. Just a few housekeeping remarks, just to remind folks, we will be shortly starting a panel discussion. However, before doing so, we have some remarks from Chancellor Rose Patten. Just if you can silence your phones. For anyone that requires use of the bathroom or washroom, I should say, out in the hallway here, there's a gender-neutral washroom in addition to accessible washroom, and then there are additional ones on the lower level of the house. If you don't wish to have your photographs taken today, if you can just let a member of the events team know as well, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So next, I would like to introduce Rose Patten, Chancellor. So Rose Patten is the 34th Chancellor of the University of Toronto, where she is also Executive in Residence and Adjunct Professor in Executive Leadership Programs at the Rotman School of Management, a member of Massey College, and a distinguished former chair of the Governing Council. Currently Special Advisor to the CEO and Senior Executives at BMO Financial Group. She is well known for her 30-year career as a senior leader in the Canadian financial services industry and has extensive experience as an advisor in the fields of senior leadership, development and succession, strategy execution, and governance in corporate and community settings. Among many other awards and distinctions, she holds an honorary degree from the University of Toronto and is a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, a member of the Order of Ontario, and an officer of the Order of Canada. I'd also like to add, she's a very dedicated member, host, ambassador for the university through the Rose Patten Mentorship Program, and so a lot of folks here and across the university have the honor and privilege to participate in that. I'd like to welcome Rose.
Thank you for this, David, and good morning to everyone. I am so glad to be here for this very important event this morning, and thank you for the t-shirt that you're going to give me so that I will be able to wear it through the rest of the day as well. Let me first say that this, I believe, is one of the most important days in the life of our community and our country. The establishment of an official, ongoing national recognition was long overdue. It is necessary. It's necessary that we should be part of a regular collective observances as much as it can help to promote accountability and spur us on. Residential school survivors, their families, and their communities continue to suffer from their experiences. It is an intergenerational trauma as well as an individual one for all of those affected. And in so many ways, Canadians have only begun to take and show responsibility for this. And doing so requires an unfaltering commitment from all of us to the actions identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As you know, the University of Toronto community is continuing to respond to the calls for action from our own Truth and Reconciliation Steering Committee. We are steadily addressing the priorities that it laid out in the areas of Indigenous spaces, faculty and staff, curriculum, research ethics and community relationships, students and co-curricular activity, education, and institutional leadership and implementations. But of course, there's always more to do across the community and across the country, and of course, our 3 campuses. And the process of reconciliation must be ongoing. Last week, we announced another specific step forward here at the University of Toronto. We committed to covering tuition for students from 9 First Nations communities whose territories include or are adjacent to the land on which the U of T operates. In addition, Indigenous or Native American students from the continental United States will be charged the domestic Ontario tuition rate in recognition of the Jay Treaty of 1794. This builds on the change that we made in 2022 to apply the domestic Ontario tuition rate to Indigenous students from elsewhere in Canada. These changes are just one part of the efforts to be more accessible and inclusive for our Indigenous students, and to build enduring relationships with our neighboring Indigenous communities. And so in turn, will strengthen our ability to fulfill our mission of teaching, research, and innovation, to which we are so greatly committed. In a few minutes during our panel discussion, we will see and hear a few wonderful examples of how our people at U of T are practicing reconciliation in their daily work. And in that spirit, I hope that our gathering today is a source of enlightenment, of encouragement, and momentum for all of us. May it herald a brighter future for the Indigenous members of our community, the university as a whole, Indigenous people more broadly, and for Canada at large. And with that, I look forward to the panel, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Rose, and that's great news about the, thank you for sharing the information about the tuition announcement. I'm very pleased to introduce Isa, so just a second here. We had the pleasure of meeting at the Hart House Arts Committee launch event a few weeks ago. And so Isa Ahmad is a second-year UTSC student specializing in mental health studies and minoring in English literature. In her free time, she paints cats. We had a nice chat about that earlier. I look forward to seeing them. And cooks for her imaginary ones as well. Isa is a member of the Hart House Student Art Committee, which provides students passionate about the art world an opportunity to meet like-minded individuals from all three campuses to work together and to connect to Toronto's vibrant arts scene. Isa.
I would like to introduce our panelists, Grant Hurley, Mikayla Redden, and Desmond Wong, followed by our panel moderator, Angela Henschel-Wood. Our first panelist, Grant Hurley, is a settler librarian and archivist who works at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto Libraries. He is responsible for curating the library's extensive collections, documenting the diverse experiences, histories, and cultural life on the lands associated with Canada. Grant also serves as a sessional instructor for the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. In 2021, he was awarded the Archives Association of Ontario's Alexander Fraser Award for exceptional service in the archival community and the MISC Outstanding Instructor Award for excellence in teaching. Our next panelist, Mikayla Redden, is a mixed-race woman of Anishinaabe and Anglo-settler heritage. She is a granddaughter, daughter, sister, auntie, helper, and learner. She lives and works on the Takarono Purchase, but was born and raised on Treaty 20. Though she is a member of Curve Lake First Nation, she was not raised in the community. Her great-grandfather is John Jack Jacobs. Jack was married to her great-grandmother, Edith Marston, of Scugog First Nation. Jack enfranchised himself and his children under Section 214 of the Indian Act in March of 1935. This means that they relinquished their Indian identities and assimilated into white settler society. Her family began reconnecting in the 1990s. She has the privilege of walking in the two worlds, learning from her relations on and off reserve, both urban and rural, traditional and contemporary, and is able to apply pieces of those knowledge into her work life as a librarian at New College. She is passionate about storytelling, anti-racist pedagogies, and amplifying the voices of Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Our final panelist is Desmond Wong. Desmond is a Chinese-Canadian settler living in the Mississauga of the Credit River Territory. As a librarian, he works with the Indigenous students, faculty, and staff at the University of Toronto. He is interested in solidarity and relational accountability between Asian diaspora and other Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. He believes that working towards land back and Indigenous nationhoods is the only way to be in good relations on these lands and towards collective liberation. And lastly, I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Angela Henshelwood. Angela is a settler of Scottish-Irish descent, originally from Kitchener, which is on Treaty 4 land. Angela is currently the head of the Engineering and Computer Science Library, but she has been an engineering librarian at U of T since 2014. Angela lives nearby with her husband and 6-year-old son on the land that was part of the Toronto Purchase. We may now commence the panel discussion.
Good morning. I'm told I need to hold the microphone close so that everyone can hear me, and that I should be able to hear myself. Just checking the technology out. Thank you everyone for coming today. We're so happy to be here. So we're here to talk about a resource that contains stories. Stories of survivors of the residential schools. So stories are a huge part of the reason that we know the truth. The courage of residential school survivors in telling their stories for decades, even in the face of disbelief and denial from the Canadian masses. They're the reason we're here today. They are the reason for this day. They're the reason for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and everything that resulted from it. So last year, we met as a group with some other colleagues well ahead of September 30th, and we wanted to determine what could U of T libraries do to contribute to truth and reconciliation in a meaningful, authentic, and appropriate way. So in the past, we had done some of the classic library things. By that, I mean we had developed research guides, we had developed reading lists, and book clubs, of course, classic stuff, as I said. But none of it was particularly impactful, and none of it was particularly far-reaching. And that is something that was very important to us, is to create something that could amplify the voices of survivors and their families and their communities and all Indigenous peoples from Turtle Island. So this time around, we thought we need something useful, we need something that is non-extractive, so it's not going to be something that takes, it's going to be something that meets a need. And very importantly, we did not want to put any additional labor onto Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples who were survivors or the families of survivors who are living with those generational traumas. We wanted to take what we know and provide something that gives a voice to survivors. So my sister, she's a K-8 educator, and she had talked to me many times about how difficult things can be for educators in particular. So educators are tasked with the responsibility of providing tools to children for them to grow into informed adults. But the problem that educators are facing, particularly those who did not receive the information about the residential schools when they were children, or not even necessarily when they were training in their teacher education, unless it was very recently. How can they provide children with the tools they need when it comes to truth and reconciliation if they do not have those tools themselves? And so what the Storybase does is it collects all of these stories from various different locations in various formats, and it provides educators with a guarantee that these are real stories from real survivors, and that there is a small collection within this Storybase that are items that are safe to show to K-8 students. Educators couldn't just go out and use anything. I think, as a lot of us know, some of these stories, they contain information that people need to be ready for. They need to have the emotional maturity to encounter. And so the K-8 collection specifically, it contains items that children can relate to. They can relate their own experiences to. And they can use their empathy to understand what it was to have something taken away, what it was to be removed from your family, what it was to feel scared. And that is the way, from what I know. I am not a teacher, but the teachers who I know, that's what they've told us that they need. And so creating this resource was our way of meeting that need. Indigenous teachers and Indigenous people in every sector do a lot of extra emotional labor. And this is also one way that we can remove a little bit of that from them by giving educators this resource to look for. And there's lots of other content in the Storybase. Canadians of all ages, from all walks of life, can access the Storybase, and they can use these stories to listen to more of the truth and learn and unlearn, and hopefully take what they've learned, encourage others to do the same, and turn the emotions that they are feeling in response to this material, these stories. They can turn that into an action. And that's what reconciliation is. It's an action. Okay, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Desmond.
Good morning, everyone. It really is such an honor and a pleasure to share our work with you this morning. Oh, great. We're already on the slide that I wanted to be on. So from our initial conversations, we wanted to think about what such a contribution would look like in the real world. There's been a long history of libraries working on their own without the guidance or ethical considerations that are necessary for such work to be recognizable and useful to Indigenous communities. We were determined not to contribute to the histories of settler colonialism and extraction within librarianship, and instead create new relations based in reciprocity and trust. We wanted to be explicit that the materials that are kept here are stories and not data, and therefore this is a story base and not a database. We knew that we had to be very intentional with all of our work, given the sensitivity and the collective responsibility we felt to survivors with such a project. We began by having conversations with Indigenous organizations that were focused on providing services and support to residential school survivors. We were and remain especially grateful to Teresa Edwards, the Executive Director of the Legacy of Hope Foundation, It is through our conversations with her that our model was formed in ethical indexing. The Storybase is an indexing repository, which means that it refers users to the stories themselves, but does not store or preserve any of the stories. As Teresa explained to us, we are not the ones who are representatives or have stewardship agreements with survivors. Instead, what would be most helpful to them and other organizations would be to use the Storybase as an opportunity to refer users to their materials and their pages. What we have instead is a Storybase that holds stories together in conversation with one another. As we will later demonstrate, the Storybase brings together stories that survivors have shared in different media, but also brings together stories based on the residential school. In the introductory page, we worked to ensure that we had a trigger warning for those engaging in the stories. I can tell you from personal experience, working on the description and indexing of these stories, that they demand an immense capacity with which to engage. In our trigger warning, we encourage users to be mindful of the capacity that it takes to engage, and invite them to consider whether they are able to commit their capacity in this time and space. If users find that they cannot, we invite them to engage at a time when they have the capacity. We were also explicit about not expressing their grief to Indigenous colleagues, friends, and community members, as we do not want this to become an emotional labor for those most affected by residential schools. Instead, we provide details to channel that understandable grief into action for Indigenous resurgence and sovereignties. This can be found on our Take Action page. We believe that this can represent a new relational model in which libraries work towards ethical collaborations with Indigenous communities. The model allows for us to assist with needs within the community while also ensuring that we are doing so in a non-extractive or exploitative way. We do not control how the stories are stewarded. If the survivors or their families wish to withdraw their ongoing consent for the stories to be in the world, our link simply stops working, and when one of our regular link checks, we will remove the link that no longer leads anywhere. We do not hold control or control anything other than the brief resources and the descriptive material. This Storybase begins the work of placing libraries in good relations with residential school survivors. Now I'd like to walk you through the Storybase a little bit. First, the first page is a strategically placed to introduce our project, the ethic, other resources, and our hopes for how the Storybase can be used. There is more information on the project in the About the Project page, which also serves as an acknowledgement for the library staff that worked on this project. The introductory page starts with the aforementioned trigger warning. We include other resources that are important for learning as well. Is there a lot of feedback? I'm not tech literate enough to know. Is that a little bit better? Thank you so much. We include other resources that are important for learning as well, such as a map of unmarked grave discoveries created by colleagues from the Leddy Library at the University of Windsor, and residential school history from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We are clear that the emotional labor of processing is work that settlers need to take on for themselves. This is not a grief that we should share with Indigenous communities. Settler grief needs to lead to action and solidarity. And to that end, we have resources on processing emotions, as well as the number for residential school survivor hotlines, which is for survivors and their families only. Next, we have the search page. As part of our contribution to the accessibility of survivors' stories, the materials that we have indexed are searchable. The search page enables advanced searching. However, we want to note that the searches are only as granular, meaning as specific as the metadata will allow, and our metadata schema is focused primarily on protecting and reflecting the wishes of the survivors and their families. Next, I will show you an example of what an item page looks like. If we could please advance to the next slide. Great. Users can also browse each item in the collection. They are able to sort by title, creator, and by the date added. This page will also allow you to reach other browse options, such as by tag, which is where you will find the names of the survivors and the residential schools. All of the records that we have tagged will be linked together on the tag page, so browsing that will enable users to browse by survivor and residential school. Next, I will show you what an item looks like. If we could please advance. This is an example of what a page for the item looks like. Here, users will find relevant creator metadata such as the title, the creator, and the format extent, which means how long the audiovisual material is if it is an audiovisual material. It will also include the tags, a provided citation, and most importantly, the access link. Next, we will move on to talking about what the school pages look like. Here is an example of the Blue Quills, Lakla Beach, Saddle Lake Sacred Heart Indian Residential School page. Residential schools are often change their names throughout their operating history, and this was largely dependent on a number of factors, but that does make it difficult to create one standardized list. Luckily, we were able to use the list of residential schools provided by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation as a controlled list so that everything from the same institution is under the same name. This does not include industrial or day schools, and we are currently working through that as our next project. On these pages, tagged by residential schools, users will be able to find accounts shared by survivors about their time in that institution. Next, we have an example of a survivor page. We have also tagged stories by survivors' names. This is especially helpful if a survivor has shared their story with multiple outlets or in various media. This brings together all of the stories that we have indexed in the Storybase. And finally, we have a Take Action page, which encourages users to take their learning and their grief to ensure that we are supporting Indigenous resurgence through land, language, and life ways. The Take Action page gives concrete examples of ways in which users can engage respectfully with Indigenous communities and support contemporary political, social, and environmental causes that have direct material impact and benefit on Indigenous peoples. We hope that this explanation and tour of the Storybase will spur you to use it to listen to survivor stories. We hope that you will return to it whenever you have capacity in order to learn more from survivors' accounts or engage in new forms of commemoration and memorialization. In turn, we hope that this will encourage us all to take action and support Indigenous people where they say that they need us as allies and supports for community action. Thank you very much, and I will now pass it on to my colleague, Grant.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you to, you can hear me okay. Thank you to Mikayla and Desmond. It's been an honor to work with you both on this project. So I'd like to pick up points that both of them touched upon, which is that the Storybase provides a model, a relational model for more ethical and reciprocal collaboration between libraries and Indigenous communities. And this naturally brings up the question, how does this model then apply to the broader work of libraries and other cultural heritage institutions, and particularly our libraries here at University of Toronto. By itself, the Storybase is a very important resource. It's one that my colleagues and I are very committed to maintaining, including through the addition of new entries, as more stories from survivors find platforms online. And we've already found so many from so many different places. That's such a value of this resource, really. But its inspiration and its approach, as outlined by Mikayla and Desmond, provide guidance and practical approaches to potentially transform the work of our institution and transform the work in a way that's more respectful, collaborative, and reciprocal stewardship of collections about Indigenous communities and coming from Indigenous communities and individuals. The library holds many such examples of Indigenous stories and histories within its walls. And these stories deserve to be heard by the communities who would most benefit from reestablishing a connection with them. And so this moves from the important work of remembrance and commemoration of residential schools and their impact, which is why we're here today, of course, and towards the work of questioning and taking apart and rebuilding the systems that we work within to make sure that something like the residential school system never happens again. One of the kind of advantages of the Storybase project was that it was a new resource. It was something that we were able to create without needing to get caught up in the complex challenges posed by what I would call the legacy collections at the library, materials where there are questionable rights to ownership, offensive catalog descriptions, lack of appropriate context, and lack of community access and involvement in stewardship, among so many other problems that commonly surround collections by and about Indigenous peoples. These problems are the legacy of generations of settler colonial-minded librarians and archivists who were not interested in trying to understand the perspectives of the people whose knowledge and stories are contained in books and in archival materials and other materials housed in the institution. They were practicing the kind of extractive work that Desmond noted the Storybase is trying to work against. And so now is the time for us to really take up this more challenging work of repairing these harms in the spirit of openness and humility. And so the image you see here is of where I work, the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. It's one of the many libraries here at the University of Toronto. It's a special place, it's a beautiful space. Every time I walk in the door, I'm humbled really by the incredible amount of knowledge and voices that are reaching to me through time from this place. But the story of the lands that we call Canada, as depicted in the materials in this library, is often inaccurate, it's one-sided, or otherwise distorted. I will say there are many moments of Indigenous-led joy, creativity, pride, resurgence, and resistance that are also recorded here at the library. And part of my job is the fun of trying to bring out those stories and make them available to people. But working with my colleagues on the Storybase project has really provided me with a practical set of methods and values to bring to bear on a place like the Fisher, where doing reconciliatory work extends and attends to this entire place. Next slide, please. So we do have other guidance as well. We have the benefit of plenty of direction coming from the TRC calls to action, many of which directly call out libraries and archives for their work in reconciliation. And then groups of librarians and archivists with the input of Indigenous memory keepers, also Indigenous librarians and archivists, have in turn created roadmaps for reconciliation with specific recommendations for next steps for memory institutions. And I'll note as well that there's a vibrant secondary source literature out there as well with so many case examples that we're now, I guess, part of in a way, part of the Storybase. So the Storybase project really encoded these values as it was built, sometimes explicitly, but often implicitly, embodied by my colleagues, Desmond and Mikayla and others. And so I'd like to touch on what those values are and think about how we may work with them going forward. What do these values look like? What do they look like in relation to wider contexts? And so I've identified a few key themes that I see coming out of this project. The list of actions that I associate with them is by no means exhaustive, but it really serves as some guideposts, I think, for the work ahead. Next slide, please. So I'll start with one key value, which is reparative context. So this is really the daily work of repairing the way that librarians and archivists contextualize materials, the way that our institutions identify and describe and give access to our collections. Materials about and by Indigenous communities and individuals deserve to be identified with truth and accuracy, using terms that reflect desired terminology rather than perpetuating stereotypes. And the Storybase does this explicitly by identifying the names of individuals whose stories are indexed and the school that they attended, as Desmond noted. For example, if you're interested in finding stories that relate to our area, the closest residential school was the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, and there are 16 stories that are indexed on the site. So you can go there and hear the voices of people who attended residential school very near where we're talking today. So taking a similar approach for our wider collections of the library means seeing through key actions like restoring or removing harmful language from places like our library catalog, but also doing the work of more specifically identifying communities and community members documented in records by name and by terminology preferred by the community, and grounded in relationships to land. Second is promoting learning, and we've already really touched upon this, right? So the Storybase was envisioned as a public educational resource, including with collections for K-8 students, and it has the potential to be used in many sorts of classrooms. Promoting learning is what libraries do, that's why we exist. But being more intentional and focused and when working with learners to center Indigenous stories and knowledge is required. As Mikayla noted, there's a strong possibility that students attending U of T for the first time may have limited knowledge of the residential school system, which is a tragedy at this point in our history. So this means really stepping up and supporting classes and students, especially Indigenous students and faculty, with appropriate resources for teaching and learning. It also means educating ourselves as professionals, right? And providing opportunities for our colleagues to advance their learning and awareness around reconciliation and the work of stewarding Indigenous knowledge with respect in order to collectively transform our systems and ways of knowing. And finally, the last one kind of ties the two together really. It's collaborative collections and relationship building. So the Storybase is not an end to itself. It's not merely a matter of collecting resources and leaving them there, but also ensuring that those who should know about them do, and of building relationships that are reciprocal and community-led. So for example, when we were adding materials to the Storybase, creating organizations in some cases were contacted for permission, And these relationships have the potential to grow, right? It may be something like a simple request, but they can grow and snowball into something deeper and more generative. So for larger groups of collections at the libraries, it may be just about informing communities about their existence, right? Taking that first step. Welcoming community members into our spaces to see them, and enabling community access through digitization, and further perhaps doing things like co-curating exhibitions, or seeking and paying consultants to help contextualize materials more appropriately. My hope is that these initial efforts lead to more connected relationships that end up benefiting the origin communities more than the library. One end goal might be repatriating materials, for example, to their rightful owners. Another might be continuing to act as stewards, but in following community needs and protocols. And so the ideal outcome of all of these themes, as applied broadly to our work and the ways that libraries and archives operate when it comes to organizing, preserving, and enabling access to knowledge, are transformed, right? We need to move away from seeing collections as static objects towards understanding them to be animated, right? Full of life and agency of their own, that remain incredibly relevant to supporting Indigenous resilience and sovereignty, as well as the library's role as a memory institution in holding a record of harmful histories for accountability and reparations. Next slide, please. I'd like to end with a quote from Cree Métis librarian Jessie Lawyer. She has a wonderful essay called "Collections Are Our Relatives, Disrupting the Singular White Man's Joy That Shaped Collections." It's been an incredibly inspiring piece of work for me as a practitioner. It's provided me with so much guidance in my time in my role. And she really underscores the principle of relationality in its relationship with collections. She writes, quote, "Those of us who work in cultural memory institutions must first build kinship with our collections and understand them as our relatives. Being in relationship with a collection means being part of an extended family, a complex web of kinship networks. Even beginning to name these networks is a radical act of understanding material in collections as animated by relationality." So the Storybase project is an effort to extend this kind of care, to recognizing the experiences of residential school survivors, listening to them, engaging with those stories, and encouraging others to seek them out. And as Jessie Lawyer highlights, libraries have the potential to extend the same kind of care to create relationships of accountability, reciprocity, and trust between our collections, ourselves, and Indigenous communities whose kin are in our midst. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Grant, Mikayla, and Desmond. It was wonderful to hear from you and about your wonderful resource that you created for all of us. So actually, I'd like to begin with a question. Could you tell us where to find the Storybase?
Yes. So the name of the Storybase itself is a little bit long. It's the Indian Residential School Survivors Storybase, but you can find it at uoft.me/storybase.
Yes, great. ut.me/storybase. Great. Okay, so you did touch on this a little bit during your talks, but I'd love it if you could expand more on the emotional toll this project took and the labor around managing your emotions while working on the Storybase.
So the Storybase currently contains 519 stories, which we have been steadily adding to throughout the year. I think all of us have been involved in adding materials to the Storybase, but one of the things that has been really important for me to remember is that it's all right to take a break while engaging with these stories and to process the grief that I feel when listening to these things. Many of the stories in the Storybase are audiovisual materials, and I think audiovisual materials as a medium is especially impactful in transmitting the emotions. You can see the body language, you can hear the breaths that people take, and it has been really challenging. And so in the trigger warning, where we warn people that they should return to this material when they have the capacity to do so. I extend that sort of, we put the trigger warning in really as a sort of, as an act of relationality, as an act of care, and so extending that act of care to myself and others who have worked on this has been really important in working through and making sure that the emotional labor that we feel and the grief that the emotional labor and the grief that we feel is a responsibility in and unto ourselves that continues to sort of spur our action and our commitment to this work.
I'm just hoping there's no feedback in this anymore. No, it sounds good. Okay, wonderful. So, you know, speaking of emotional care and protecting others, that's been my experience working on this project. So I'm really lucky to have true, authentic allyship as an Indigenous member of this team. So I have been protected. I have not been asked to encounter any materials that could bring harm to me. And I am not even an Indigenous person who has a legacy of residential school in their family. As was said in my introduction, I'm from an enfranchised family. And that means that my family's status was taken away. And what that also means is that I did not grow up in a household where the stories were present. I didn't encounter them until I was older as a child, when I met survivors after reconnecting with my community in the 90s. And I haven't had to handle these stories, and I haven't had to look at them unless I choose to. And so, you know, thank you to my wonderful colleagues who have intentionally provided that protection for me.
I'll just add a little bit insofar as one thing that prepared me to work with this project was that there's wonderful research and literature on secondary trauma experienced by archivists, led by a scholar at UBC named Jennifer Douglas. And through my years working with archival associations, we've also put on workshops on trauma-informed practices for archives. So I'm aware of some of these things and was kind of prepared to go into this project with that knowledge. But working on this team did feel different in that when we were putting together the resource and finding stories to add to it, my son Ren was 9 months old. I was a new parent. I started parental leave with him on TRC Day last year, so there's kind of an association there. And so I want to say that being a parent is not a requirement for somehow better understanding or learning about residential schools, but I will say that having a child and thinking about the prospect of losing him is extremely painful to contemplate, and it's something that was going through my head a lot when we were working on this project together. Hearing parents talk about this loss and the loss of family members and loss experienced by children themselves was really difficult for me as a new parent, just because I love that kid so much. It's really led me to understand something deeper about the harms that have been experienced, and also how that trauma has passed through generations. But again, I'm really grateful to my colleagues, as you said, for supporting one another and giving each other permission to kind of step back when needed in order to pull this important resource together.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So the next question I have is, can you elaborate on what you mean by extractive practices in terms of librarianship? Grant, go ahead.
I'll just maybe add some notes. I'm sure Desmond has thoughts about this as well. But I think the thing to remember, at least for me, is that the term extractive practices should be thought of in the same terms as something like resource extraction, right? Removing something of value from an Indigenous community where the value of that resource then gets circulated elsewhere, but
does not return to the community it came from. So Indigenous knowledge is one such resource. It has circulated in academic economies for generations and has benefited individuals who work in those economies. And these models are changing, of course, through more collaborative and reciprocal models for research. This is happening here at U of T, I know. But that legacy is still there, and it shaped the collections at our libraries and archives. Libraries and archives did this work for the benefit of preservation, but for the preservation of that academic economy. They've had a long tradition of seeing Indigenous cultures as something to be documented rather than as subjects or agents. This comes up all the time when you read 19th century materials about Indigenous peoples, frequently come across them at the Fisher, that Indigenous knowledge should be preserved because Indigenous peoples were thought to be not long for this world, right? Thankfully, that is not the case. In fact, quite the opposite. And that's why these days there's lots of discussion in the news about repatriating materials, especially in museum contexts, and the baffling resistance of institutions to pursuing repatriation, even when it's obvious that these materials were acquired under dubious circumstances at best. And this is, of course, a form of resource extraction. And it's especially serious because these materials are often sacred or others very significant culturally. And it's the part that memory institutions have played in cultural genocide, right? Removing culture from context.
So non-extractive practices, they center relationships. Everything from an Indigenous worldview centers relationships. Relationships are the most important thing in an Indigenous worldview. And that's also true of these non-extractive practices. We have a history here and in every educational institution, certainly higher education, that we must produce. And so information has been taken by members of this institution and many others. It was taken, it was written down, it was treated as data rather than stories, and it was published. And then it was used for promotion, career promotion. And that's something that's changing here, although there are still plenty of problems with what is happening in publishing. Don't let me get into it. But non-extractive practices, they don't appropriate or remove knowledge from its rightful owners. So in the Storybase, any of these stories that Indigenous peoples are no longer consenting to being available, they won't be there anymore. Indigenous people have the right to own, control, and possess their own information, their own data, and that is something that we will always respect, and we will always protect that right. So an example of a non-extractive practice would be research that is community-based. So we hope to see a lot of that going forward, is more production that is meeting a need, that is guided by Indigenous communities, that is not quantifying them and being used to other them. We're interested in meeting needs, in creating a space for people to find stories so that folks can learn the truth and hopefully head towards reconciliation.
When I think about extractive practices in the library and in our institutions, I'm often reminded of the words of Dr. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who says that research in Indigenous communities, research is a dirty word. I think that the same systems that created the residential school system are the same systems that also created the library and the worldviews that we hold within the library. And so non-extractive work for me, and I think for us in working in the Storybase, means a decentering of those worldviews and a centering of the needs and the wants of Indigenous people, and especially survivors.
Great, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge that I do have one or two more questions, but we would like to hear your questions as well, so there will be time shortly for you to go to a mic and ask a question. So I'm just going to skip one of them. So you talked about how the Storybase is also meant for K-8 teachers to support their teaching around truth and reconciliation. So how do you plan to promote it to elementary school and middle school teachers?
So I am a librarian at OISE, and so I think about this a lot. First of all, we have been promoting this to pre-service teachers and the Masters of Teaching program, and have been doing so since the inception of the Storybase. And so teachers have had a lot of support, or teacher candidates have had a lot of supports when it comes to navigating this material, as well as other things that we have been able to do to support them around teaching about truth and reconciliation and the residential school system. We hope that you may have seen in the past couple of days, there has been a little bit of media attention for the Storybase as well. My colleague Mikayla was on CBC Metro Morning this morning talking about the project. And so we hope that in this public awareness that we hope to drive via the media, that more teachers will be able to engage and to look through the materials as well. I think it's much easier to navigate what is appropriate to bring into your classroom if you're looking in a list of materials that is already pre-curated in terms of looking through the capacity and the emotional labor for K-8 materials than it is to, say, have to navigate through all 520 of those materials. And so we hope that that is a meaningful and valuable contributions to teachers in the province.
So there was also a little bit more news coverage because Desmond was interviewed for Global News. So if he's going to shout me out, I'm going to shout him out. So like I talked about, in my family there are a lot of educators, and they were, when we were first talking about what we can do last year, they were the ones that I thought of. And so they're the ones that I've continued to talk to. So I know several teachers in my family, and then outside of that, who I've already shared this resource with, and who have already been checking it out. So I think that we'll continue to, promote it to new teachers, to talk to current teachers, to use our networks, and hopefully all of you will spread the word to, if you're parents, if you know parents of young children, and use it yourselves, because there is content in there that is appropriate for Canadians of all ages to access survivor stories.
Great, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge my shirt is different than the one that most people are wearing from MJ Singleton. Mine is the one that was created for the Toronto District School Board. So I feel like that represents a nice connection that we're trying to, and relationship that we're trying to build between U of T and the public school system around truth and reconciliation. So my final question is, what's next for this collection, and how will it be maintained?
So with every project, sustainability can often be something that is a little challenging, but we, in planning the project, thought about the maintenance and the long-term sustainability of this project moving forward. And so I am definitely one of the people on the team who is committed to continuing to sustain this Storybase. In fact, in the last year, around this time last year, we had about 200 items, and as I have mentioned, we now have 520 items. In terms of moving forward, we do have also an additional approximately 115 sharing panels that were created and made available through the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Right now, they are somewhat undifferentiated, which is not something that we necessarily want, because they basically all just say sharing panel. And so we're looking for ways that we can respectfully describe the sharing panels as well, so that they are more navigable and easier to use. And so that is the next project that we are going to be taking on for the Storybase, that will add, hopefully, additional stories to the Storybase as well.
Great. So if you'd like to come to a mic so the folks that are joining us online can hear you, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you for a very illuminating panel. My question is about the initial decision to cap the reach from K to 8. And if you could address how you intend to, I suppose, provide material for people who would be above those grades and at tertiary level, but also because, as you've already mentioned, and those of us who've accessed stories know, because some of it is triggering, but also equally important for people to learn, how is that going to be addressed and disseminated? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. So when we consulted with educators regarding the sort of age range, we determined that we thought about the Storybase as a form of scaffolded learning. But the relationships and consent and capacity of students from grades K through 8 are different, and a different set of expectations and conversations than those who are in 9 to 12. And so when we talk to teacher candidates about this, between the sort of junior intermediate or primary junior versus the intermediate senior, so intermediate senior is 9 through 12, I believe, we anticipate that they will have a different set of capacities and conversations with their students. And so when we spoke to the educators that we consulted with, that was their recommendation, was to make a set of materials that were really explicit for K to 8. However, we recognize that there are different growth trajectories with regards to emotional maturity and being able to handle the material. And so we do continue to advise that all educators make sure that they watch the materials and evaluate whether or not it would be appropriate for their own classrooms and their own classroom communities. There are other resources that are available, not necessarily through the Storybase, around scaffolded learning on residential schools, but these would include things that are created by the Legacy of Hope Foundation, lesson plans, teacher materials, and other supports of that nature. And so there is a lot of support out there. And hopefully teachers who are looking to engage in this material will be able to tap into that network and the resources that are available as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonjour everybody. Mahishka Khanjinga Indigenous Bude Wadminwa Kakda, Gnondo them Ishkagmok Ndochpia, Dade Bude Wadmine in the Demama Winnebago Meti. Hello everybody. Give an introduction. My dad is Potawatomi First Nations from the United States, actually, where I'm enrolled, and my mom would be considered Métis, but she is part of the Ho-Chunk tribes in the United States as well. Before I give my question, I just wanted to say thank you to the Chancellor who's here today for recognizing what they have done for tuition. That applied to me, and I was really happy to read that in the news, that instead of paying an international tuition rate, I get to pay a domestic rate as I do. My tribe does have relatives here, especially in Ontario, that live within Manitoulin Island, so to have that type of recognition from the executive branch really brings a good feeling to my heart. And I was going to say, one of the things that talk about Indigenous relationship building is talking about connectivity of the heart. Our etymology always refers to ode, which means heart, so community literally means a web of interconnected hearts. So I'm really glad that you're able to bring us into this community. My question to the panelists, as well as others listening, is from an American perspective, I was going to say, we have a lot of legislations and policies, especially about truth and reconciliation, that have been in effect. Part of your guys' stories is to record and to ensure that these residential school survivors are heard, as well as can be documented so people can share the experience of what had happened in this country's history. But my question then is to ask is, what can you guys do collectively in order to ensure some type of legislation outside of what is happening on the boarding schools to ensure that relatives that are being held in other types of institutions, usually archaeology or anthropology, what can you guys do to advocate for a form of legislative action on a federal level in order to bring these relatives home? In the United States, ever since the American Indian Freedom of Religious Act, we have an act that can bring any item or relative that is held in collections home as it is required by federal law. However, to my surprise, when I came to Canada, I didn't realize the Americans would have something like that, considering here there isn't a legislative action in place. So thank you for hearing my question.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for speaking your traditional language, because that was beautiful, and I love people speaking their traditional languages in colonial spaces. I just can feel a tremendous amount of power because you did that, so thank you. I don't really know how to answer your question. I don't know that we have that type of power. I would love to be able to influence policy like that, but we have to start here at the U of T before we would be able to move on to something at a governmental level from my perspective, but I'll give my colleagues a chance.
That was my thought exactly. It's like modeling the work here first, and hoping that that work then expands outward, basically. It's ironic, there's something about the way memory institutions have been kind of atomized into their own kind of professional areas, and so we don't collaborate very much right now with, say, people at the ROM, even though they're next door, practically, and hold all sorts of materials that are very similar in nature or have similar questions that you're raising, right, about rightful ownership. But my hope is that by doing this work here, I have projects that are I'm working on that are actively trying to do that work. We can start reaching out to other institutions and perhaps even just identify if they're doing similar work, right? We've been kind of separated, I think, by these false boundaries around institutions who hold different kinds of memory, even though they are all in conversation with one another at the cultural level, right? So yeah, I think I wish I could influence federal policy directly. If anyone knows how to do that, I'd love to hear from them. But I think modeling the work is the first step, as you said, Mikayla.
Thank you for your question. I think that one of our hopes in making this work accessible, or making these stories accessible and doing this work, is to contribute to a system that holds settler colonial powers and institutions accountable. And so I think that this project is inherently a conversation about accountability, and we hope that this starts the accountability conversation with a number of different people in the community. We were very explicit in the very inception of this project to be speaking to teachers and to speaking to the education system. A lot of the people who we hope will be engaging with our Storybase and with these materials are students who will go on to become leaders or are already leaders within the community. We hope that they will continue to be emboldened to hold powers accountable, to do the right thing, to learn about truth and reconciliation, and to continue to contribute their energies and their advocacy and community organizing towards Indigenous resurgence, towards land back, towards all of the things that we know make a material difference and a material benefit for Indigenous communities. And we hope that this is but one small offering and contribution to that larger process.
Are there any other questions for our panelists? Great, thank you.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My questions are sort of about what kind of support you all receive from the university in undertaking this project, and how the university can support these types of initiatives moving forward.
We've received a lot of support from, well, specifically from the University of Toronto Library system, which is where this has come out of. Right from the get-go, there was a broad recognition of the importance of this work and a lot of encouragement for us to be able to use resources such as working with our student colleagues or taking sort of in-kind contributions. The entire infrastructure of the Storybase is also based on support from the University of Toronto Libraries, which is the OMECA content management system. And so that really took a lot of labor off of us as well, so that we could focus on the parts that we're sharing with you today. But since then, the University of Toronto and the University of Toronto Libraries has been very, very supportive in sharing this Storybase widely and ensuring that members of the public and other people who would be interested in this work would be able to access and to know about it. And so we've received quite a bit of support, both sort of in mentorship and infrastructurally, but also in dissemination and in recognition of how important this work is and has been.
Okay, great. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I actually have two questions, if it's okay. So the first one is, I think, if I understood, it's not that the Storybase holds the stories themselves. They're stewarded by community organizations or whatever. I was just curious, because I think obviously that's great. And also things like web hosting or whatever, it costs money. So how is the University of Toronto able to sort of share those resources when needed or desired? You know, like if a story is lost because, yeah, like the website went down or whatever it is there any conversation in terms of that relationship building around how that can be a reciprocal resource sharing thing?
Yes, thank you for that question. I have many different ways of answering that question, and so maybe I'll sort of parse through each of them. We have thought about, so the University of Toronto Libraries has a direct relationship with the Internet Archive, and it has been suggested that perhaps we might want to put those materials in the Wayback Machine, but we haven't done that because we're worried that it takes the control of those stories and that consent away from the communities themselves. And so while we don't have a direct resource sharing relationship with some of these platforms, we have, of course, reached out to a number of organizations who have said that the traffic that we would be able to bring is in and of itself a contribution, because there are many people who don't necessarily know about the survivor stories and accounts on their website. But in other parts of our work together, we are actively reaching out for digital collaborations around digital Indigenous heritage and being really collaborative and moving this model, like a post-custodial model, as we would call it, into other work that we've done. And so currently we are working with a number of Indigenous organizations who are looking to us to support via infrastructure for things like long-term digital preservation as well as dissemination. And so while it's not necessarily confined to this project, in other ways we are contributing and being hopefully valued collaborators and partners in Indigenous digital heritage.
Thank you, Desmond. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. My prior training was in preservation of digital materials, so it's obviously like forefront of mind, but I would echo everything that you noted, with the addition that we have established a good relationship with the NCTR archives. And are exploring, this is early days, but exploring possibilities for partnership between the NCTR and University of Toronto libraries as a means of supporting their needs as well when it comes to access to infrastructure and other kinds of resources, which is very exciting, but as I said, quite new, yeah.
Perhaps it might be helpful to maybe mention that one of the projects that we have already launched is preservation of all and dissemination of the Eastern Door, which is a Mohawk newspaper, which is the first time that it has been widely digitally available to post-secondary researchers, and is also a long-term digital preservation partnership that we have launched with the Eastern Door as well. So that would be an example of one of these resource sharing projects.
Cool, thank you. Is it okay if I ask another question? Oh, well, just having grown up in a Jewish community, like I'm really struck by, like in our community we grew up, like you gotta listen to the survivors of the Holocaust, like you have to preserve these stories so, it never happens again, and all these different things. And, I think as many of us can probably recognize, like colonization is ongoing, and, there are many different forms that it takes. I'm curious if the scope, if there is an intention at all to broaden the scope, or if it does feel like residential schools and the survivors of residential schools and day schools and stuff like that are going to sort of be the center of this, or if there is a hope or intention to expand it to other forms like the child apprehension, or other forms like that.
Thank you for the question. For the scope of this project, we are really intentional in keeping it to residential school survivors' stories. However, that doesn't foreclose the possibility of working with other communities and launching other projects that would be equally important to tell other stories. There is capacity and a lot of space to be able to do that at the University of Toronto Libraries, or with whichever partners communities really choose or feel comfortable with. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I think that brings us to our time. So I want to once again thank Grant and Mikayla and Desmond for sharing about the Storybase today. Thank you.
Wow, it was, the sun is shining on us on the front row, and as we're watching and listening, just so many emotions. I want to repeat and say again, thank you, Grant, Mikayla, Desmond, to Angela for moderating, providing us such a meaningful opportunity to listen and to partake, and to those who asked questions, really appreciate those thoughtful questions. Might I invite us just to give one more round of applause, because this is just so moving. I also just want to say, as an educator, I really look forward to exploring this resource and thinking about ways to bring it into my own pedagogy. My partner's a middle school teacher. I'm excited to go home and say, check this out. The link again is uft.me/storybase. I also want to thank you for your efforts into this work, this very important work, for sharing your experience about this, and for speaking about it, including, sounds like as recent as this morning, through media. It is a powerful tool to ensure educators have access to stories that reflect the truths and pains of Canadian history, and also to shine a light on the strength and courage of Indigenous peoples. I would like to turn our attention to, there's the next slide here. So First Nations House is hosting a fire for Indigenous community members happening at the Earth Sciences Courtyard, and that will be today until 3 p.m. So please take note. Before closing, I would like to express our thanks to the Tri-Campus Planning Committee for all their work put into organizing today's event. To Alex Gillespie, Vice President and Principal, University of Toronto Mississauga, Rose Patten, Chancellor, for their remarks, Isa Ahmad for introduction to the panel, and MJ Singleton for this year's Orange Shirt Day design. Loving this pattern, the color, of course. So as you can see here, the names of the planning committee members. Yes. I'd also like to make sure we give thanks to the volunteers that put so much time to work out and the details, intricacies of today, and to put all the pieces together to make today happen. So we've got our volunteers here, if we can give an applause. I also need to make sure to note we do have gifts for the panelists available, so just that will be, we will hand those to our panelists after the closure of today's ceremony. As we come to the end of this deeply meaningful event commemorating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I am filled with such a profound sense of hope and unity. Today we've taken a significant step towards acknowledging the painful truths of our past, honoring the resilience and strength of Indigenous communities, and committing to a future built on reconciliation and understanding. Thank you to all who have joined us today in person and online, and may the principles of truth, I'm going to use the word reconciliation, thank you, and respect guide our actions every day. Miigwech. Thank you. And with that, we will close the formal proceedings today. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and continues with the conversation reflection. Thank you very much.